Of our two alternative inauguration events this evening and tomorrow. We hope that you'll join us tomorrow as well for a rich discussion about imperialism and the rule of law surrounding Keely McBride's new book. Keely is with us tonight as well. Her new book, Mr. Mother Country, the reference, of course, being to James Stephen and his descendants, and the Macaulay family, or a dynasty, all administrators in the British colonies, just published at Oxford University Press. So we'll be doing that tomorrow at 2 p.m. As our Alt 2017 event. But tonight we're going to focus on Frantz Fanon, both in his relationship with Nietzsche, but also beyond Nietzsche, on the way in which we can think with Fanon today in these political times. And this seminar on Fanon could not possibly flow any more seamlessly from the last seminar we had, which was in Paris, on Aimé Césaire. As you know, the very first words of Fanon's masterpiece, Black Skin, White Masks, are taken from Aimé Césaire's discourse, le discours sur le colonialisme. And the very first words of his book are from Césaire. I am talking about millions of men whom they have knowingly instilled with fear and a complex of inferiority, whom they have infused with despair and trained to tremble, to kneel, and behave like flunkies. Fanon's book is in deep dialogue with the writings and thought of Césaire and the Négritude movement that Césaire, Senghor, and others inaugurated about a decade or so before the publication of Black Skin, White Masks in 1952. And as with Césaire, there is in this work a sustained conversation with Nietzsche, a conversation which undergoes significant transformation, evolves over time, and I would say is absent, or at least explicitly absent, expressly absent in Fanon's final work, The Wretched of the Earth, published at his death in 1961. But in 1952, Fanon bookends his work with Nietzsche, who serves as a conversation partner throughout. He's both the first philosopher explicitly mentioned in the text and the final philosopher who closes the last pages of the conclusion. Fanon closes his book after returning to the Marxian theme of disalienation with this penultimate thought that at the start of his life, a man is always congested, drowned in contingency. The misfortune of man is that he was once a child. Now, the task of overcoming that immaturity, of overcoming our childhood, would not be easy, in part because of the peculiar history of French slavery and colonialism. In that section titled The Black Man and Hegel, Fanon argues that the Hegelian dialectic of master and slave couldn't play itself out in the same way in the French context, because the French lord, as well as the colonized, are basically different from the ones described by Hegel. The colonizer does not seek recognition, and the colonized is far more dependent on him. In the French context, Fanon writes, the black man does not know the price of freedom because he has never fought for it. It has just been given to him in some diluted form. This leads, on Fanon's view, to a purely kind of reactional phase full of ressentiment, and it's therefore to Nietzsche and his will to power that Fanon turns to articulate a positive, actional call to arms. Quote, Nietzsche had already said it in The Will to Power, Fanon writes at the end of the last chapter in The Black Man in Recognition, and Fanon adds once again, accompanied by Nietzsche, to induce man to be actional by maintaining in his circularity the respect of the fundamental values that make the world human. That is the task of utmost urgency for he who, after careful reflection, prepares to act. It's this positive, willful call to action that Fanon leaves us with in 1952, a call to introduce invention into life, to build the world of you, to always question, to disalienate, to touch the other, feel the other, discover each other, to take a stand against this living death, to be a revolutionary. But of course, if Fanon ends Black Skin's White Mask with a discussion of the Hegelian dialectic and a Nietzschean resolution of that dialectic focused on the will to power, things are very different 9 years later at the end of his life with the publication of The Wretched of the Earth. One could say, having fought on the side of the Algerians against the French, been deported to Tunis, continued to wage war on France. Fanon strove to put Europe and European thought behind, to put Nietzsche behind him as well, perhaps. And so it is perhaps now at this point in this seminar, Nietzsche 1313, with Fanon and his remarkable, radical, intellectual, and biographical historical trajectory, that we may finally be able to put Nietzsche behind us, or not. Perhaps maybe be able to level a necessary critique, an overdue critique, of the very project of Nietzsche 1313, to get past the past, to forge new models, new paradigms, to innovate, to be pioneers, as Fanon explicitly states. And as he says on the closing pages of The Wretched of the Earth, let us not pay tribute to Europe by creating states, institutions, and societies that draw their inspiration from it. If we want humanity to take one step forward, if we want to take it to another level than the one where Europe has placed it, then we must innovate and must be pioneers. And there is in Fanon simultaneously this perhaps Nietzschean impulse to get beyond the resentment of reactivity, to embrace invention and knowledge as well, while at the same time this idea of leaving behind the 19th century. So those are some of the questions that will guide us from Fanon perhaps to the present. And to discuss this, we are delighted to welcome three brilliant scholars and friends. Emily Apter, who has been a lively participant in this seminar for a year and a half now, joins us from NYU this evening, where she is professor of French and comparative literature. Emily has written extensively on questions of world literature, translation, and untranslatability, has helped spearhead with Stathis and others the Political Concept Project, and has, for me, guided my thinking in extremely illuminating ways about authors like and including Fanon. And she's the author of numerous books, including Against World Literature, On the Politics of Untranslatability, The Translation Zone, Continental Drift, Feminizing the Fetish, and we're just delighted to have her with us. We're also delighted to welcome my dear friend and brilliant colleague, Homi Bhabha. As you will have noticed, Homi Bhabha has just written the new preface to the new translation of The Wretched of the Earth, which does an absolutely remarkable job of recontextualizing and bringing to date Fanon's work. He has, as you know, many other feathers in his cap. He's the Anne Rothberg Professor of English and American Literature and Language, the Director of the Humanities Center at Harvard, and author of many seminal books, including Framing Fanon and The Location of Culture. For now, though, because the preface is so remarkable, I wanted to read to you the final paragraph, which I find brilliant and moving, and particularly important on an evening like today. Homi Bhabha writes, "Each age has its peculiar opacities and its urgent missions. The parts we play in the design and direction of historical transformation are shadowed by the contingency of events and the quality of our characters. Sometimes we break the mold. At others, our will is broken. What enables us to aspire to the fraught and fervent desire for freedom is the belief that human beings are capable of imagining what Fanon once described as a time that must no longer be that of the moment or the next harvest, but rather of the rest of the world." That takes us to Brandon Terry, who is someone who, I think in Homi Bhabha's words, breaks the mold. It's simply marvelous, moving, and thrilling to have Brandon with us this evening in New York City. Not only because Brandon and his partner Shige, just a newborn daughter, Anya, not just because we can surround him so well, all of us here, including his dissertation advisor, Shayla Ben Habib, and mentor, Bob Gooding-Williams, and his other friends, but because I personally have never left an intellectual encounter with Brandon not feeling as if I had grown and learned from him. So I'm thrilled to share Brandon with you all this evening. Of course, he's a professor of African and African American Studies and Social Studies at Harvard University. He works at the intersection of political theory, history, and African American studies, and we're all excited to read soon his writings on the tragic vision of the civil rights movement. After Brandon, we'll turn the conversation over to my dearest friend and co-convener, another great thinker who breaks the mold, Jesus Velasco, who will moderate the conversation. I just wanted to add one word to welcome everyone else to this conversation, all our colleagues around the table, and thank them for participating in this remarkable seminar on Nietzsche, for being here. Bob Gooding-Williams from philosophy, Stathis Gourouguris from comparative literature, Nadia Urbinati from political theory, Sheila Ben-Habib also political theory, John Rackman theory and criticism, Neni Panurgia in anthropology, Eduardo Cadava, who joins us from Princeton tonight, and Boyman from the French department, Keely McBride, who's going to be on tomorrow, Linda Myers, who will also be speaking tomorrow, and Josh Simon from political theory, Andrew Diltz, who's at the Institute for Advanced Study this year, George Schulman from New York, etc. It's so wonderful that you're all here for this conversation. We're going to ask our three speakers to limit their interventions to 15, 20 minutes so that we can have a rich conversation, all of us together. Thank you. Emily, you're going to start us off.
I'm first.
Oh, is that okay?
That's okay.
I was going to go alphabetically. Yes.
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 Okay. Well, let's. Is that working? No, not on yet. That's better. Well, thank you so much, Bernard and Jesus, for this invitation, to all of you for coming on what is indeed a grim evening on the eve of things we don't even want to think about. So I'm just going to plunge in, but also I would just like to say it's a particular pleasure to be on this panel with Homi, who I haven't seen in a very long time, and to meet Brandon. So let me get started. In his post for this week's 1313, Bernard hARCOURT exhorts us to forget Nietzsche, using Nietzsche contra Nietzsche as only Nietzsche might commission his own nihilistic self-forgetting, to provincialize Nietzsche in line with Dipesh Chakrabarty's injunction to provincialize Europe, and to think the times, the strange tragedy of our raced actuality, the violent untimeliness of the dawn of a new confederacy, shored up by openly racist policy, with and through the medium of a singularly Fanonian theory and practice of ressentiment, flushed with Fanon's ambivalent self-critical dialectics of blackness, or négritude. This last point comes to the fore in the chapter of Black Skin, White Masks on the Negro and psychopathology, where Fanon approvingly cites Gabriel Daboussier's denunciation of Sartre's existentialization of generic Black suffering, which Daboussier calls out as, quote, the dangerous mystificatory aspect of theories of negritude. The objection is valid, writes Fanon. It applies to me as well. Against all the arguments I've just cited, I come back to one. Wherever he goes, the Negro remains a Negro. Où qu'il aille, un nègre demeure un nègre. So how to overcome the impasse of the Black man's overdetermination as non-being, the condition of his occluded sovereign ego and foreclosed access to universal humanity. In Fanon's clinical foray into the philosophy of a new subject, there was recourse to Nietzsche from the start. The Zarathustrian man of affirmation, poetically captioned as a, quote, yes that vibrates to cosmic harmonies, occupies a universe that must become a universe of the Black man too, even at the price of cauterizing the historic Black subject, cutting him out of himself, severing him from his antinomies and his agonistics. I'm using the he as opposed to the they because this is, of course, Fanon's language, but for no other reason. As scholarship on Fanon's library confirms with reference to passages that Fanon underlined in his copy of Charles Andler's Nietzsche, His Life and Work and Thought, Fanon seized on the necessity of the transvaluation of suffering, infused with Nietzschean terms of normative right, specifically the right to civilization and to life. A temporally situated Fanon inside the Nietzschean cosmic chronotope beyond the time frame of Euro philosophy's unconditional priority, yet within the perdurable generic time signature of the so-called evidence of Blackness. This helps frame and brings into focus emergent languages of ethico-political militance and vigilance. These languages have produced marked terms of anti- and decolonial struggle drafted for an early 21st century age of assaults on civil liberties, Black citizens' rights, including but not limited to voting rights, and economies of existence that refuse to reduce racial difference to bare life. Particular attention in my remarks will be devoted to several psychopolitical constructs that could be said to sublate aspects of Nietzschean ressentiment or Fanonian reactivity. The first is Achille Mbembe's post-Schmittian take on the politics of enmity, retournement, and juridical humanity, which reworks through a Fanonian psychiatrized lens the relation between violence and colonial force of law in the context of racist structures of securitization and anti-migration. The second is Mbembe's notion of nano-racism, which stands as a politically nuanced alternative to the institutionally proliferating and highly problematic term microaggression, whose performative effects obviously vary depending on the situation, the illocutionary context and subject position. The third is Alexander Wehele's concept of habeas viscus, a term denoting sociogenic imprints on the hieroglyphics of the flesh, pornotroping as deprivation, and what he calls, critically building on Deleuze and Guattari, racialized assemblages. So a central concern that undergirds this discussion for me is how might we think with Fanon to rethink the micropolitics of racist psychopolitics, especially at the historical juncture of militarized policing and the rhetoric of what I'm calling a new confederacy. Achille Mbembe builds his book Politique de l'inimitié, the politics of enmity, around the problem of Schmittian enmity-amity, in which inimitié is calqued onto amitié, friendship. The ambivalent relation between enmity and friendship, assiduously deconstructed by Derrida in The Politics of Friendship, extends to homophonically related terms such as inimité, inimicalness, inimitability, or matchlessness, and intimité, intimacy, proximity. Now, the spine of Mbembe's book lists the title erroneously as Politique d'inimité, which translates roughly as inimical politics or incomparable politics, and prompts the suggestion that maybe this slip is not entirely wrong. He may, in fact, be addressing what is inimical to politics, its peerless capacity to mask hostilities as acts of friendship and goodwill, its ability as a medium to foment and circulate hostilities of every stripe and scale. Inimitié, which gained traction in the 18th century as a synonym of enmity implying targeted charge at a person or collectivity, is akin to ressentiment, particularly its French ascription as an untranslatable in languages other than French. So in other words, it's always appearing as ressentiment across languages in a kind of remarkable way. Both terms are premised on an objet a causative object desire, exterior to the subject, that entrains loving the enemy, desiring the enemy as oneself. For Nietzsche, this neighbor-loving is the trap of the noble Christian man against whom the man of ressentiment, whose soul squints, must gird himself. Enemy desire must be used against itself, resisted through a politics of concentrated hate that leaves its trace, as Mbembe sees it, in apartheid, fantasies of extermination, hate speech, logics of suspicion, conspiracy theories, anxiogenic formulas of the war on terror, and a host of other symptoms of paranoid democracy and racist ethno-nationalism. Under such conditions, to be, as it were, deprived of enemy becomes the worst punishment, tantamount to removing pretexts for negative disinhibition. The hallmarks of ressentiment associated by Nietzsche with slave morality, envy, insecurity, frustration, defensiveness, guilt, weakness, kind of nastiness or nursing of petty grudges. These are recouped in a way as permits for the maintenance of a politics of inimitié. If hostility must be preserved at all costs, ressentiment functions as a prophylactic that wards off the privative consequences of comedy, peace, compassion, and care. And by means of this inverse logic of reasoning, or this inverse reasoning rather, a logic of defensive instrumentality enshrined in the obsession with securitization is privileged as the overriding principle governing juridical humanity. Its manifest symptoms include the unilateral justification of deportation, collateral damage, world policing, and mass incarceration, but obviously not limited to those. And yet, ressentiment inscribes the possibility of backlash, reverb, and recursivity in its very prefix. The of re-feeling redounds to the affective subject, with self-transformation and self-destruction equally possible in the becoming. Ressentiment, in its Nietzschean associations, resonates with return, the eternal return, retournement, as in a life-changing transformative experience, or being turned like a spy, or Deleuzian anti-dialectics, the will to power as infinite devenir. It also echoes with recurrence, whether it's in structural violence, cyclical repetition, colonial mimicry, or autoimmunity. Or Membe's planetary à rebours, identified with necropolitical inversions of human value or eco-political regress. And finally, it echoes with reversal, Christian love, renversement, as in Deleuzian critical reversal, the differential element from which the derivating value of values issues forth. All these effects are registered in Membe's enmity politics, even if he does not explicitly name ressentiment as the catalyst. They inform his descriptions of pathogenic modes of reactivity and structures of regression. And these structures lead back to Fanon, who, in Black Skin, White Masks, is concerned with working through the devastating effects of ressentiment on the Black psyche. He devoted many pages to dissecting the Black subject's pathological sensitivity and what he dubbed affective erethism, the desire for vengeance and her morbid will-sapping fixation on past injuries, or the painful realities of Black-on-Black ressentiment, which he names as such, using that term, as when Guadeloupean Blacks become the object of ressentiment on the part of Martinican Blacks for trying to pass as Martiniquais, or the hatred of Senegalese soldiers by Antilleans. Such infra-racisms were and remain easily marshaled as psychopolitical technologies through which societies of control divide communities of color. The concern to counter the self-defeating recursivity of ressentiment brought Fanon to sublatory strategies for breaking the cycle that included going beyond comparison and going beyond the Negro as comparison, where the Negro is the yardstick of non-being against which white humanity is measured and through which the measure of humanity is erased. As Bernard hARCOURT reminds us in his post, he quotes Fanon, the idea, it seems, is to get beyond notions of superiority and inferiority, not to respond that Black culture is in fact superior or equal to European culture, but to overcome the comparison itself, to get beyond these moral judgments, not to refute them, not to invert them, to get over them entirely as if they never existed. For Fanon, the stakes of breaking the cycle, or the cercle vicieux, embedded in the dialectics of ressentiment, point to a sublation that might today be associated with woke racial consciousness. In Membe's book, by contrast, there really is no moment of critical awakening or structure of sublation. Ressentiment is baked into modes of being in the political present. It's a persistent feature of enmities that are themselves identified with autodestructive practices of biopolitical annihilation, autophagy, baffled revolutionary telos, the continuous reproduction of sadomasochistic social relations and inferiority-superiority complexes whose contemporary narcotic form is nanoracism. Membe chillingly identifies nanoracism as a modern pastime, where before there were outlets such as public games, circuses, palace intrigues, cabals, and gossip, now there's nanoracism, a sick divertissement, a narcotic version of race prejudice reliant on poisonous compounds that induce, and these are his phrases, tetanized stupor, paralysis, and contracted sociality. Nanoracism, traceable to Fanon's pharmacy, proliferates in the guise of what he calls minuscule madnesses, distributed through systems of social existence in dosed portions of neurosis, psychosis, and erotic delirium. For Membe, nanoracism, whether identified with the lived experience of people of color or with expressions of white domination, and these are two obviously very different paths, has become a common denomination of planetary enmity. In this picture, politics is a psychopolitics characterized by a reactivity typically ascribed to persons. This approach to the political allows Membe, much like Fanon and Nietzsche before him, to diagnose state violence through the lens of subjectivized history, not personified history, but history comprised of agents in the process of being reactively subjectivated. Where Fanon would locate freedom in a purgative overcoming of perverse cycles of enmity that form the crux of colonialism as such, Membe will chart the dynamics of injury and hate within persistent social microcosms and global networks of nanoracism, mapped as countless discharges of negative affect within force fields of brute sensualism and capitalist lubricity. Interestingly, one important characteristic of nanoracism is its indifference to scale. The smallest gestures can trigger great trauma, thus placing quotidian blessure on the same plane as world historical catastrophe. Microaggression and genocide, though not proportionally equivalent or similar in kind, become at times structurally interchangeable within an omnibus system of distress disorders that perforce introduce a certain ethical relativism. This relativism makes it impossible to rationalize trauma within ethically coherent systems of retribution and redress. It presupposes and posits an extrajuridical subject of injury that is stranded, irrecuperable even by nosological standards. Nanoracism thus renders virtually impossible the conversion of focused, soul-destroying, pathogenic rage and suffering into self-determination. It arguably impedes, to borrow Joseph Lawless's terms of the Deleuzian Nietzschean paradigm, the shift from the active-reactive to the affirmative negative mode, whereby negation proves foundational to an emancipatory becoming. Rather than tarry with the negative, with Nietzsche, Membe returns us to a Hobbesian state of nature in which the most one can hope for is a return to the unfinished Fanonian project of politico-existential psychiatry forged in the crucible of militant anti-colonialism. For Membe, then, I would argue the poisoned chalice of the Fanonian pharmacon contains a pessimistic politics of inimities specific to the contemporary global condition, which is to say, characterized by intractable iniquities and inequities at levels both great and small, and jumbled in scale. As nanoracisms proliferate and gather momentum, they prepare the ground for a new confederacy built up from the defensive and ultimately self-defeating political calculation that took hold in the Obama administration, when it was presumed that any ownership of the, quote, Black agenda would, as Eric Holder put it recently, produce a reaction in the larger community that would have prevented the things he wanted to do. The result, by the end of Obama's second term, was what I would call a preemptive reactivity to reactivity that shut down the potentia of Black calls for racial equality and left unimpeded the political ascendancy of white nationalism. I'm going to stop there because I know we have other papers coming, and so if we want to return to Wahele, I'm happy to do that, but I think that's a good point to stop.
Yes, preemptive reactivity to reactivity. Okay, we're going to come back to that a lot this evening. Homie?
Thank you, Bernard and Jesus, for inviting me, and I'm delighted to be here amongst friends and also people who I'm interested in initiating discussions with. But it's a great pleasure. I first encountered Fanon's primal scene of the everyday racial encounter, dirty nigger, or simply look a Negro, while I was speeding on Lacan, a high from which I have happily never quite descended. I was intrigued by Fanon's account of the excessive asphyxiating desire of what he calls the white gaze, directed through an insistent and iterative temporality, that he works again and again in a kind of diurnal litany through the various chapters of Black Skin, White Pasts. Look a Negro, look, look, look. And it's important to remember, of course, that he is rewriting this seminal moment. And so the idea of rewriting the experience is absolutely central, as I will argue, to reading it. It's not simply the white gaze, but it is rewriting the white gaze, repositioning it, reactivating it, as I will argue, to actually turn it around chiasmatically. Look, a Negro, look, 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 as if there is some deep uncertainty as to what indeed we're looking for, and no guarantee at all that we will find it, whatever it is we're looking at. The Black person is fixed, Fanon recalls, as you fix a preparation with a die, backwardness, fetishism, racial stigmas. But in my view, something always stirs and quickens in the rigor mortis. An anxious acrobatics of effect and identification that Fanon describes as an atmosphere of certainty, uncertainty, unfixes the die and rapidly produces the very phobic proximity or intimacy via projection, displacement, inversion, which then becomes the desired and denigrated object of racial contagion and political containment. So that in fact, there is continually, even in the fixity, there is a kind of a space in between, and that space is the space of the uncertainty. So no relationality can actually work without being mediated through it. So even if at times Fanon sounds as if the gaze is a directive gaze, it's an imperative gaze, I believe that in fact, when you read more deeply into Fanon, this is not the case. What you see or look at is not what you get. Or as Fanon puts it, I thought I was being asked to construct, through the look, through the gaze, a physiological self to balance space and localize sensations, when indeed, all the time, they were just clamoring for more. To be deprived of one's ontological resistance, as he puts it, and to become, as he says, an object amongst other objects, is to be sure a near-death experience replete with gallows humor and gallows horror. I wanted to kill myself laughing, Fanon writes, but laughter had become out of the question. I think this is the interesting notion of the look back of the object, you know, and this notion of gallows humor reminds me, of course, in my Lacanian dependency on the sardine can in Lacan, whose jokes are almost as bad as Freud's jokes, because you can't really laugh at them. And the sardine can, I always thought, was one of his jokes. But you have the same kind of idea here, that the notion, and laughter is actually quite important. The horror of laughter, actually. Du Bois, as I recall now, writes a whole essay on laughter as this kind of anxiogenic and also resistant moment. But from within the life-death experience of these dispersions of my person, there arises a temporal injunction, a kind of ethical and aesthetic risk, I will call it, that wagers the wounded vestiges of one's ironic resilience, the leitmotif of much of James Baldwin's work, against the shameful biopower of racial profiling and policing that is so precisely captured in Fanon's phrase, "I am overdetermined from the outside," and so tragically repeated in Ta-Nehisi Coates' litany of dead black lives. Trayvon Martin's hoodie got him killed. Jordan Davis's loud music did the same, etc., etc. So we can begin to see these prosthetics of the body emerging now. The hoodie, indeed, a lot of the writings of Black Lives Matter is also about these kinds of prosthetic identifications, extensions of the body. You have a hood, you play music, you touch somebody's gun, and suddenly you find you're dead. Ethical risk, as I'm calling it, at once political and intellectual, begins for Fanon by rejecting racial science as an idea or ideology that assumes governmental powers in what he describes as, and I quote him, the name of tradition and the long historical past. And in my view, one of the things that Fanon does brilliantly is what Benjamin called the recognition of the now. That's when in all these repetitions, look, 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 it's that notion of things attaining to their legibility at a certain time. There's a whole section around that, but of course I've summarized this in 15 minutes, so there are many issues I haven't been able to touch. But more painfully, risk demands the renunciation of the free figure of the rights of man and citizen. I wanted to be a man and nothing but a man becomes a kind of cynical, ironic statement. In addition, it must risk the authority of the historicity that Jaspers had taught me and question the existential hope held out by Sartre's concept of dialectical progression as it surmounts the moment of negativity. So these are all the things that have to be, in a sense, dealt with. To unfix the die demands, in Fanon's words, that and I quote him, that the fragments have to be put together by another me. And on that very day, this white winter's day, on this train, this autobus, even as the child is saying, look, a Negro, maman, a Negro, Fanon finds another me in an active translation that reverses the present imperative that condemns the Black person as die to an object position, look, into a present continuous of self-reflexivity, a subject position where being is unfixed in racial time and open to the deliberative agency of what I'm calling ethical risk. Fanon speaks from this chiasmatic pivot that reverses the imprisoning imperative present into an interventionist proleptic present without closure. To resist being overdetermined from outside, which I use with the resonance of racial profiling. In fact, I'm reading Fanon this time round. It is so much about racial profiling, as I will say in a moment. You know, when you try to work around the ontological issue, what you're often left with are these signifiers of racial profiling. I think it's the great text for racial profiling. To risk being overdetermined from the outside, the disruption of the time signature is crucial to history's transformation. Fanon writes, if I had to define myself, I would say I am in expectation. I'm investigating my surroundings, this sort of present continuous, the reflective, somewhat subjunctive. I'm interpreting everything on the basis of my findings. I have become a sensor, SENSOR. I define myself as absolutely and sustainedly open-minded. That which has been shattered is rebuilt and constructed by the intuitive lianas of my hands. Now, I have some problems with the intuitive and with the lianas too, but I think this is really quite important, that Black Skin's White Mask is being written continually as a reassemblage, reminding me, of course, and in the longer paper, I talk about it in the chapter of this idea in Benjamin again of history as montage, the important nature of montage. History, he says, or Marxist historiography should in fact have a surrealist face. And this is the whole issue that I'm dealing with at the moment in a series of pieces on what I call death life. Fanon derives another time from a negativity, which in his words, does not draw its value from a virtual, substantial absolutity. I've never heard of that, but I'm a great admirer of Richard Philcox, and if he says the word should be absolutity, then I absolutely believe that it should be absolutity. A very substantial absolutity for consciousness committed to experience, he writes, has to know nothing of the essence and determination of its being. And of course, as always, Fanon leaves you on the edge, having uttered these things, and then you have to flounder and somehow make sense. Indeed, it is by working with the negative that Fanon finds a way, working with the negative without essence and determination, that Fanon finds a way out of the long historical past of identitarian essentialism and nationalist determinism, irrespective of race, region, ethnic groups, or power structures. Look a Negro, and all you will see is that the Black experience, as Fanon says, is ambiguous, for there is not one Negro. There are many Black men and women. Look a nation, and you will find only what he calls the national stage, a translational and transitional awareness, as he puts it, that national consciousness, which is not nationalism, is alone capable of giving us an international dimension, because international consciousness is at the heart of national awareness. And as we know, many of the early phases of anti-colonial nationalist movements actually worked that way. That to be national was to be international or cosmopolitan. Certainly in the Indian context, in the Latin American context too, I think it was the case. Fanon's style of thinking and writing operates by creating repeated disjunctions, followed by proximate juxtapositions between the will of the political agent and the desire of the psychoaffective subject. His discourse does not privilege the subjective over the objective, as I've said, or vice versa, nor does he simply say that the two happen at the same time, nor does his argument prescribe a hierarchy of relations between material reality and mental or corporeal existence. And his lyrical and poetic style actually keeps these things in a very tenuous and precarious balance, but I think that is the power. The power is as much in the saying, as much in the very act of enunciation as an ethical move. The double figure of the politician psychiatrist, someone like Frantz Fanon himself, attempts to decipher the changing scale, measure, and judgment of a problem, event, identity, or action as it comes to be represented or framed in the shifting ratios and relations that exist between the realms of political and psychoaffective experience. Staying true to Fanon's view of rebuilding what is shattered, as he puts it, through a form of negation without essence and determination brings me to James Baldwin. There can be no reparations for the theft of time, but history can be repossessed and memory repositioned by following Baldwin's profound exploration of the negative way and its chiasmatic figure of death life. to give myself up as an object, to give myself up as an object. Fanon also has to perform a negating ritual of death. I quote him, peeling, stripping my skin, causing a hemorrhage that left congealed black blood all over my body. Fanon and Baldwin dwell on the aesthetic depths and the moral weight of what I'm developing in my book as the burdened life, not their life. These reflections on the negative way must be sharply distinguished from the negativity of the consensual liberal subject of rights, who, as Foucault has pointed out, is by definition a subject who accepts negativity, who agrees to a self-renunciation and splits himself, as it were, to be at one level the possessor of natural rights and someone who agrees to the principle of relinquishment. This is a completely different way of thinking about negation. The burdened life allows for no such choice of citizenly civility. People who are forced each day and night, and this diurnal measure is to me very important, the notion of the day by day in a whole context of illustrations of or experiences of the burdened life. Who are forced each day and night, the phrase is from Baldwin, to snatch their authority from under the foot on your neck without hating the hater, develop a remarkable ethical resilience, Baldwin argues. But white Americans, he says, one of his most brilliant statements, while white Americans do not believe in death, and that is why the darkness of my skin so intimidates. I was completely stunned. I mean, I just was working on Baldwin only 3 weeks ago, after many years, and I was just stunned by it. To understand Baldwin's version of the death-life metaphor, we must hurry past Hegel's Aufhebung and grasp Baldwin's dialectic of reversal, his chiasmatic strategy for throwing off the foot on his neck to achieve his own authority, a resilient ethical agency. Similar in some respects, and I'm again constricting the argument here, to Walter Benjamin's cultural and historical dialectic, a chiasmatic critique brings renewal through reversal and transformation by a certain translation. In most epochs, the forward-looking positive side of the age, Benjamin says, is set off in contrast to its negative obsolescent part. The negative provides only the background for the enhanced visibility of what is dominant or deemed progressive. To decisively reverse this order is not to transcend the contradiction, but to rework the initially excluded negative component so that by a displacement of the negative, an angle of vision of displacement emerges and a positive element appears in it anew. And I think so much is done with Benjamin on dialectics as a standstill. I think some of his less his less developed thoughts on what he calls dialectical contrast is actually produce a kind of displacement. In a sense, of course, the dialectics of the stillness is always a movement. It's always a fibrillation. The dialectics of the standstill is a continual fibrillation. It is not a standstill. It's a continual resonation. Baldwin's most provocative reversal of the negative way, displacing our angle of vision, is his largely overlooked belief in the positive value of what he calls earning our death. The root of human trouble, totems, taboos, steeples, mosques, races, armies, nations, lies in the inability to earn our death by confronting the conundrum of life. It is only by earning our death that we are in a position to, I believe, to understand what he means by achieving our country. Richard Rorty, of course, has written about it. In a chiasmatic reversal of the myth of manifest destiny, Baldwin, in a sense, earns his death. I'm one of the first Americans to arrive on these shores, so this country can scarcely be considered a white nation. To earn one's death is not merely to have genocide or slavery officially recognized, nor is it the civic tribute to those who die in the service of the nation, nor can it be, as Baldwin says, the consolidation of people on the basis of their color. We earn our death when we fully realize, I quote Baldwin here, that the price for transformation is social and psychic risk, no matter what. Baldwin's risk inverts the negative risk carried by the precariousness of Black life into an intellectual and ethical category. Ethical risk productively puts at risk the patriotic demeanor of American domestic and foreign policy by displacing its psychic and social disavowals. And it is remarkable to read Baldwin today in the context of what he has to say about domestic politics and international politics. I could not include the entire quote for due to time requirements. He says, "We take no responsibility for what goes on in our country, and internationally, we are an unmitigated disaster." But the actual quote is longer. A half century after the fire next time, Ta-Nehisi Coates borrows his title from a crucial phrase in Baldwin's text, "Between the World and Me," and takes on the challenge of ethical risk to conceive of what he calls a vulnerable cosmopolitanism. Coates' insight into vulnerability as a worldly diasporic condition begins with his poetic intuition, preceding his political conviction, that there is an ethical lesson to be learned in the acutely contradictory and ambivalent conditions of death life that constitute the risky survival of the discriminated and disempowered. The vulnerability of the void, as Coates names it, echoes Baldwin's void. This void, this despair, this torment, and sets Coates on his negative way. He soon learns the hermeneutic method of living with radical vulnerability and risk that Baldwin prescribes as a way of learning to earn your death. To survive the worst that life can bring, day by day by day by day, look, forces you to look beneath appearances and to hear the meanings, he writes, behind the words. And once you find yourself in possession of other interpretations and alternative realities, and indeed face to face with the anxiety of alterity, you are well on your way to inverting, reversing, and displacing the angle of visibility in order to create what Du Bois once called your tantalizing contradictions at your own risk. Once again, the risk Fanon tasks with Black experience as ambiguity, no essence, no determinisms, comes to the fore in Coates. And out of ambiguity comes the possibility, the potential, the capacity for affiliation. Coates writes, "I saw that we were in our own segregated body politic cosmopolitans. The Black diaspora was not just our own world, but in so many ways the Western world itself. Part of me thinks that your very vulnerability brings you closer to the meaning of life, just as for others, the quest to believe oneself white divides them from it." And if you trace from Fanon through Baldwin, this continual use of between the world and me, between the world and me. In Baldwin, it's a wall. In Fanon, it's a white wall. There's this amazing resonance of almost a soundscape of conceptual work. Baldwin's charismatic legacy to writers who faced the fire this time is the craft of risk and the ability to earn their debts. In her lyric poem, Stop and Frisk, Claudia Rankine uses a charismatic technique to reverse what she calls the American position of the Black body thrown against a sharp white background by turning our attention to the Black man as an invisible body caught in the blind glare of police headlights. Get on the ground. You are not the guy and you still fit the description, because there is only one guy who is always the guy fitting the description. Get on the ground now. The upright standing of all American citizens is at stake as Rankine displaces our angle of vision in the Benjaminian sense to rest on the prone body of the racially profiled. What emerges anew from working with the excluded negative component in the chiasmatic mode I propose is visible in the way in which Toni Morrison's beloved earns her death in order to reclaim her historical and fictional life, or Anna Devere Smith reworks the twilight zone between institutional injustice and individual despair to emerge with a new art of care and grace, or Rankine tirelessly labors with the body of silence and suffering to answer Baldwin's call to lay bare the questions hidden by the answers. And she does. A pulse in the neck, the stiffness of the hands, an unconscious blink, words encoding the bodies they cover. And despite everything, the body remains. Rankine's phrase, "the body remains," stayed with me when I read Coates's Between the World and Me. The protagonist of the narrative is neither the subjectivity of personhood nor the identity of the citizen, but repeatedly and relentlessly the body. In a similar vein, it could be said that the authorial persona of Frantz Fanon's oeuvre is the psychoaffective body, which is, in his phrase, the growing focal point where citizen and individual develop and grow. The body is a writing instrument, an agent of inscription as intervention, caught in the restless agony between violence and security, surveillance and protection. Diasporic worldliness emerges when subjects and citizens awake to the reality that the mirror image of American exceptionalism is in truth the double face of American exclusionism and expansionism. Adrienne Rich takes the argument of cosmopolitan vulnerability to the very heart of the condition of citizenship, national and global, in these verses written during the First Gulf War. And in so doing, she finds, if you follow me, her own chiasmatic poetic persona, what she calls the internal emigrant. A citizen trying to wake from the burnt out dream of innocence, to remember that blessing and cursing are born as twins and separated at birth, to meet again in mourning, that the internal immigrant is the most homesick of all women and of all men, that every flag that flies today is a cry of pain. Where are we moored? What are the bindings? What behooves us? Having strayed from Fanon to Baldwin, Coates, Rankine, and Rich, I hope I've kept alive the memory of his work by keeping faith with the anxiety and the chiasma of the negative way, to rebuild what is shattered without the essence and determination of its being. And indeed, I said earlier that and this is part of the longer reflection, that it is only by taking the enunciative moment of risk and vulnerability that these writers can really understand the question of safety, not the issue of security. And if you read even a writer who I greatly admire, Jeremy Waldron, whose work on security I think is extraordinarily interesting. Very interesting how he says, we must always, however, write from the basis of safety. And I think this whole tradition, because they write from the living experience that now, the recognition of now, what is attaining legibility at this moment, it's deep insecurity, risk, earning our death, to earn our death before we can achieve our nation. It is from that perspective then that it's interesting to see how in this tradition that I in this paper very briefly mentioned, there's a continual distinction between what is safety and what is security. And of course, we know the dire result of it now, that we live in the most securitized time and there is no safety. Really, the question of safety, I think, and much of my book is about this notion of what I call culture and safety. But I just wanted to add that. So I hope I've been able to show that what it means to rebuild what is shattered without necessarily essentialism or determination. These questions that Rich leave us with return us directly to Fanon's political territory and his discursive temporality. I'm interpreting everything on the basis of my findings. I have become a censor. Generations of readers across geographies and history, as I show in the introduction, Wretched of the Earth, turn to Fanon armed only with an imperfect sense of obligation towards the ideals they want to serve and the values they seek to preserve. The message they take away is surprisingly quiet and contemplative, and its efficacy lies embedded in its ambiguity. Each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it or betray it in relative opacity. Thank you very much.
Yep. So firstly, I'd like to thank my dear friend, Bernard hARCOURT, for inviting me down to participate. I've already learned an extraordinary amount, and the conversation seems like it's going to be fascinating. And it's just always a pleasure to be here with you. I also want to thank Jesus for helping to organize this and for moderating the discussion, and Anna for organizing the travel. I don't know if she's in here, but thank you so much. Thank you very, very much. I wanted to, so my remarks will be in the sort of spirit of Bernard's invitation, slightly polemical and hopefully provocative to push the conversation in another direction, which I think has lots of resonances with what Homie and Emily are up to. So in the closing essay of his collected volume, Look, a Negro, Robert Gooding Williams poses the question, supposing Nietzsche to be Black, what then? To suppose Nietzsche to be Black in Gooding Williams's sense is not to imaginatively subject him to an adventure in transracialism, a la John Howard Griffin's Black Like Me, but instead to suppose that he may be interpreted with an eye to the typical concerns of African-American thought and Black studies. That this question and Gooding Williams's tentative answers to it appear at the end of a volume bearing the title, Look, a Negro, is appropriate. The quote is, of course, from Fanon's famous phenomenological essay, The Lived Experience of the Black Man. And Gooding Williams explicitly, albeit briefly, draws a connection between Nietzsche and Fanon, suggesting Fanon's exemplarity as an intellectual figure who productively deploys Nietzschean philosophical insights to analyze and expose racist ideology. Accordingly, when Gooding Williams proceeds in the essay to offer some, quote, fruitful points of departure for an Afro-modern philosophy inspired by Nietzsche, one of the primary domains he suggests for such consociation is the critique of European colonialist and racist fantasy. These continue to be where Fanon's import and his Nietzschean resonances loom most largely in the academy. There's an interest in Fanon primarily as an agent of unmasking critique in the Nietzschean tradition, as one who levels hammer blows to the false idols that flourished in an age of European decadence and domination. In Fanon's hands, the ontological certainties that once seemed to mark clearly the domain of violence and pick out its enactments with ethical and epistemic clarity seem instead to falter under the weight of history and hypocrisy. Violence no longer appears commensurate with physical force, but with the imposition of language, the arbitrariness of administrative rule, and cultural stigma. In his essay, Algeria Unveiled from a Dying Colonialism, for instance, Fanon wrenches the French crusade against the practice of veiling in Islam out of its colonial horizons of emancipation and education and into a continuum of violence intimately connected via affect, function, and imagination with rape. Behind the lofty appeals to the emancipation and empowerment of women, Fanon insists, is the colonizer's barely concealed and predatory will to power, here construed as, quote, the will to bring this woman within his reach, to make her a possible object of possession, and to somehow overcome the veil as a, quote, limitation of his perception, sadism, and adventure. So in a rearrangement of the Nietzschean schema, it might be here said that ironically, it's the birds of prey who make use of feminism for their benefit. This ontological unsettling, as in Nietzsche, goes hand in hand in Fanon's work with an unmasking critique of central moral political concepts. Perhaps nowhere is this resonance more apparent than in their shared ambivalence toward the ethical ideal of human progress and Europe as the key site of its realization. The most level-headed are led astray by this illusion, Nietzsche warned, as mankind does not advance, for it does not even exist. Instead, he suggests, the overall aspect is that of a tremendous experimental laboratory in which a few successes are scored, scattered throughout all ages, while there are untold failures and all order, logic, union, and obligingness are lacking. He goes on to mock what Europeans conceive as progress, as innovating, decadent, and barbaric, while drawing attention to the comparative vitality of other peoples, past and present. It is in moments like these, as Gooding-Williams acknowledges, that Nietzsche dates Europe, shows its contingencies, records its illusions, violence, and waste, all while opening up imaginative space, not only for a regenerated and redeemed Europe, but for a horizon of human aspiration beyond Europe in some sense. There are even now few thinkers more fully identified with this project than Fanon, who echoes in Wretched Nietzsche's sense of the decadence at the heart of Europe, his exhortations against imitation, and his judgment that fitness for producing human excellence and vitality are indispensable criteria by which to judge a social order. In this vein, Fanon offers his well-known exhortation to the survivors of colonialism to, quote, start over a new history of man, which takes account of not only the occasional prodigious theses maintained by Europe, but also its crimes, the most heinous of which have been committed at the very heart of man, the pathological dismembering of his functions and the erosion of his unity, the stratification and bloody tensions fed by class and racial hatred. That these themes dominate our view towards Fanon's import should not be surprising given the affective and intellectual politics of anti-racism at the moment. They speak firstly to a prevailing and more easily assimilated conception of Afro-modern thought, as concerned above all else with the task of anti-racist critique, and as an indispensable supplement to the rational reconstruction of the so-called Western tradition. And as Jean-Paul Sartre's enthusiastic preface to Wretched still conveys with elation, there is an expectation that the white European encounter with such, quote, irrefutable testimony, in Sartre's words, might allow for a decentering disclosure, one where the passive inheritor of privileges of empire discovers their, quote, true self as an object and begins to feel the revolutionary or at least transformative feeling of shame. Whether or not, as Stokely Carmichael and the great Columbia scholar Charles Hamilton once wondered, Americans even are capable of any longer feeling shame or condemning ourselves, is a question that we will have many occasions to ponder with unique intensity starting tomorrow, as the first Orange president takes his improbable place alongside Madison, Lincoln, and Roosevelt. But what I want to draw our attention to in my remaining time, however, is that while these emphases seemingly allow us to elude and disavow for a time the forthright revolutionary and disciplinary implications that Fanon himself distilled from his analysis, it strikes me that in the end, his politics may not be so easily disentangled from his conception of the problem of colonialism. Here, I take it, is one of the crucial arguments advanced by David Scott in his Conscripts of Modernity. There, he charges post-colonial theory broadly with a failure to pursue an adequate interrogation of the present, and a concomitant failure to identify the difference between the questions that animated former presents and those that animate our own. The approach he defends is one that approaches the animating hopes, projects, and concepts of the past in order to reconstruct, quote, the way those hopes reflect a certain understanding of the problem to be overcome, the way the sources of discontent or the obstacles to satisfaction are conceived and defined. In a brief invocation of Fanon, Scott expresses a deep concern that even as post-colonial critics have rebuked and diverged from Fanon's particular answers to the problem of colonialism and neocolonialism, they have nonetheless taken aboard his image of colonialism, the conceptual preoccupations that image elicits, and the constraints on judgment it imposes. So I want to build upon these provocations and, in the spirit of the seminar, throw out three Nietzschean themes that are central to Fanonist conceptions of the problem space of colonialism. These themes deserve scrutiny not only because they are often uncritically taken aboard, but also because they are prone to generating significant analytical confusions and misguided normative responses. These themes may be broadly characterized as: one, the privileging of repression and psychopathology and a hermeneutics of suspicion; two, the search for ressentiment in Black political life; and three, the positing of a great politics of struggle between Europe and the Third World. I won't be able to talk much about the last one, but I just will throw a brief thought out about that. So I hope to illuminate these themes through an increasingly unfamiliar site of engagement, which is the African-American encounter with Fanon in the Black Power movement. If you ever look at the back of your Fanon books, the little blurbs on them all speak to the initial encounter with Fanon in the United States. It's that he influences Eldridge Cleaver or Malcolm X or Amiri Baraka, people who are no longer as widely taught as Fanon, but are in part the reason for his quick uptake in the United States. And he became arguably the most important intellectual touchstone for an emergent generation of radicals, militants, and revolutionaries coalescing under the sign of Black Power and who once commandeered one of your buildings. Prominent African-American intellectuals and activists turned exuberantly to Fanon, adapting his picture of colonialism to Afro-American conditions, theorizing the idea of an internal colony as a way of describing the Afro-American condition. They appropriated his emphasis on sex and psychopathology in the theorization of racial domination, and they wrestled with his judgments on revolution, third world solidarity, and nationalist politics. The controversial writer and Minister of Information for the Black Panther Party, Eldridge Cleaver, referred to Wretched as the Black Bible, and figures from Stokely Carmichael to the social psychologist Kenneth Clark to even Martin Luther King found themselves invoking and arguing with Fanon in print. A return to the Black Power moment is a bit of a gambit, to be sure. Fanon explicitly resisted some characterizations of anti-colonial and Afro-American freedom struggles as equivalent, and having died in 1961, did not have the personal engagement with Black Power militants that he did with Algerian revolutionaries, Pan-African militants, and Negritude intellectuals. But my argument in favor of revisiting this site is that it shows how bewitching this picture of colonialism can be, even to those who have quite readily available reasons to resist its applicability, and because the sort of queerness of this approach, its unfamiliarity in this sort of conversation, I think actually helps us see some of the stakes more clearly and more seriously entertain alternative thematizations of racial domination. I can only gesture at these due to time constraints, but this Fanonist legacy still surreptitiously affects theorizations of urban social problems, Black cultural formations, and our understandings of the history of Black political practice and thought. So it's widely acknowledged that Nietzsche's thought in many respects anticipates some of the core commitments of Freudian psychoanalysis. It diminishes the conscious will while enlarging the import of drives, psychological types, and physiology. He also advances a conception of repression that becomes significant for his interpretations of culture and ethics. In one variant, the genealogical account of duty and promising that emerge from debt and punishment, repression occurs on a kind of civilizational or species level scale. We remember or know the impulses, feelings, and logical arguments that induce us to feel guilt and recognize duties, but we have somehow forgotten their violent origins. More in line with Fanon's interest in repression, however, is its application to personal and social psychology. On this account, there exists a will to power in Nietzsche, an instinct for growth, accumulation of force, durability, and vitality that's natural in our species, and which can be a source of enjoyment. The furtherance of our will to power, when met with opposition, however, instinctively looks to attribute resistance to another will, resist that resistance, and perhaps seek vengeance upon it. When we lack the necessary power or courage to effectively discharge this vengeful impulse in instinctive ways, it becomes what Nietzsche calls, quote, a chronic disease, a poisoning of body and soul, which we have to bear about with us. Thus, we search for other avenues of release, like ressentiment, where there's a revaluation of values and perhaps an attempt through cunning or abjection to somehow reassert our power, or forgetfulness, without which Nietzsche surmises there could be no happiness, cheerfulness, hope, pride, or immediacy. Further, and again, more in resonance with Fanon, there can be a sublimation and redirection of these energies toward other objects or practices like asceticism. It strikes me that fear is a crucial element in these arguments. It serves a decisive role in Nietzsche's account and genealogy of the origin of the idea of God, one of the most repressive ideas. And what is remarkable is that Fanon, at least in Wretched, generates a very similar structure of argument. For Fanon, a kind of existentialist will to freedom supplants the will to power, but fear and repression are still fundamental explanatory concepts. They underwrite his notion of the colonist as an exhibitionist when it comes to violent repression. They underwrite the idea of the police as guardians of the Manichaean line. And they underwrite his powerful emphasis on the relationship between fear and arbitrary administrative power. In a heavily policed world of mixed cultural messages, where one's status as a colonial subject is marked by vulnerability to the arbitrary deployment of extravagantly symbolic violence, uncertainty, Fanon argues, is the norm. He captures a kind of paralyzing tension that goes along with this picture of a way of life, describing how the colonized person becomes, quote, confused by the myriad signs of the colonial world, and thus never knows whether he is out of line. In constant fear of retribution for transgressing boundaries that move arbitrarily and that might be imposed at any moment, the very first thing a colonial subject learns, Fanon argues, is to, quote, stay in his place and not overstep its limits. He argues that the tension developed in the colonial subject from the experience of violent oppression and this kind of repression, coupled with their fear of the colonial apparatus more broadly, leaves them trying to seek ways of relieving this tension without actually having to confront the colonial power responsible. Yet because Fanon's sense of colonial terror and Wretched is so expansive and totalizing, and I think that's not the case in Black Skin, White Mask, and we can talk about why. But because it's so expansive and so totalizing, everything from popular myth to religions, to spirit possession practices, to dance, to crime, all becomes catharsis. Writing about myth, he says, the colonized subject draws on the terrifying myths that are so prolific in underdeveloped societies as inhibitions for his aggressiveness. In scaring me, the atmosphere of myths and magic operates like an undeniable reality. Zombies, believe me, are more terrifying than colonists. And the problem now is not whether to fall in line with the armor-plated world of colonialism, but to think twice before urinating, spitting, or going out in the dark. Turning to the Black Power appropriation helps us see some of the implications of this view. Under Fanon's influence, many Black Power intellectuals offered a description of the Afro-American condition as that of an internally colonized people whose destiny was incongruent and at odds with the civic affiliations and aspirations of American nationalism. They were subject not to second-class citizenship on this account, but to cultural degradation and socio-political domination on par with colonialism. Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton, for example, used the idea of Blacks constituting an internal colony to characterize the US as scarred by cultural imperialism and to introduce their influential distinction between individual and institutional racism. This view of internal colonization helped underwrite a similar hermeneutics that claimed to reveal the origins of Black deviance and repressed rage and internalized inferiority. So I think we can show the implication of the wretched repression argument in the ways that it's taken up in this Black Power discourse. Their analytics of crime, of drug addiction, of violence, their sense of where domestic abuse comes from, their sense of why there's so much, why there's even a category that exists called Black on Black crime, right? This notion that Stokely Carmichael gives a speech that basically maps on right to the point in Wretched of the Earth, where all of you are scared to fight the police, to fight the military, but you'll cut any Negro that looks at you cross or steps on your sneakers at a nightclub, right? And that's all run through an argument about repression. And this happens at the level of folk psychology, so these Black militants, but also at the level of professional psychology. Alvin Toussaint, right? This is the sort of last era of the great influence of African-American psychologist, Kenneth Clark Alvin Toussaint, writes a book entitled Why Blacks Kill Blacks, that all is based on this argument. And the person who writes the foreword is Jesse Jackson, right? It's serialized in ebony. This is getting a lot of uptake. And this view becomes the cornerstone for a whole edifice of thinking about crime and violence. And it helps give a scientific or pseudoscientific underpinning to the notion of Black on Black crime as a useful analytical category, one where Black crime has an altogether set of sources, right? It's become qualitatively different than any other kind of crime because it's rooted in an impossibly deep and historical abjection. It's its own form of epistemic closure from the outside that Fanon is doing with his form of psychoanalysis. I argue that this obscures not only any other relevant forms of human desire or motivation, right? But that it obscures more important historical, structural, cultural, and normative underpinnings and explanations of crime and violence in Black communities, including the place of violence in an underground illicit market that's not regulated by the state. The legitimacy of policing, which is a moral notion. The regularity of prosecution and investigation and solving of crime so that there's an equilibrium of violence that might be better explained by an appeal to Hobbes than a kind of Fanonian psychoanalysis. And then a kind of micro-sociology about urban street gangs that sort of explicate the demands of solidarity in high danger environments, right? So I think all of these become much more powerful explanatory tools than this kind of depth psychology of repression and resentment sublimated into all forms of Black cultural artifacts. And then I think it's bad anthropology. It's caused, I think, 20 years of bad hip hop scholarship also. So, and so I think, so Fanon's account, it's this kind of backdrop that renders Fanon's account of the therapeutic and conversion-like elements of revolutionary violence plausible. And once revolution is off the table as a horizon of aspiration, and I think that's what happens very quickly in the African-American case, we see that this can get taken up really, really quickly to an essentially conservative project of soulcraft and discipline, right? Either enacted by paramilitary cult-like martial groups like the Nation of Islam, or by a state who rightly assumes, given the accounts of racism that are produced here, that they will never uproot the abjection of Blacks. And so because their deviance is so deeply rooted, the only response is to continue to do a form of military suppression. And to see things like loud music, aggressive dancing as signifiers of this inchoate rage that's waiting to burst at every opportunity. I will just wrap up really quickly to just gesture toward the other two, since I don't have much time. But then this notion of fear-based repression actually also rears its head in a kind of resentment-based critique of African-American politics and Black politics more broadly. It shows up in Fanon's disputes with other traditions in Afro-modern politics. Negritude is a kind of flight from reality, right? It's a fear of the will to knowledge. nonviolence becomes a kind of fear, a bourgeois fear, an attachment to material possessions. And all of these critiques to me just simply beg a question, which is how do we know that we're not afraid and that our resistance would therefore be authentic in this kind of Fanonian sense? How would we know? It seems that it involves some kind of methodological naturalism on Fanon's account. It seems to involve, at least if you take the dialectical argument seriously, some form of mimetic action, right? The rioter takes the possession of the dominant group and therefore imagines himself in the position of the privileged, the owners of society. But I think at bottom, what it really entails is not violence in the narrow formulation that we tend to put on to Fanon, but a kind of risking of life and a recognition of the inevitability of violence broadly construed. And so I'll end with just pointing out a move that I think we don't do enough with Fanon, which is that we see in his analytics of white supremacy and colonialism a very expansive notion of violence. Everything is violence. Language is violence, art is violence, advertising is violence, there's epistemic violence. But then when we talk about his political prescriptions, we think, well, violence just means guns. And he sometimes gives that impression. You know, it's not that we're wrong always for following those leads, but I think that if we follow his notions of violence and the kind of unpacking he allows us to do with the concept, we can think of it more broadly. We can think of it as a kind of broader conception that allows us to think about coercion, disruption, destruction of value, whether it's material property value or cultural values. Right? If the destruction of the colonized way of life is a kind of violence, then the destruction of white nationalism is a kind of violence, right? And so that there becomes a broader conception that allows for figures like Martin Luther King, James Baldwin to fit in a paradigm of authentic resistance because they're willing to risk their life for freedom, particularly King, and they do not deny the inevitability of violence when it's properly construed in that expansive sense. That's a polemical suggestion, but I hope we can talk about it and think about it a little bit. And lastly, I'll just say about the Great Politics piece. I was struck, again, reading Bob Gooding Williams's great essay about the relationship between Nietzsche and colonialism. And one of the things that essay points out in this fantastic new book, Nietzsche's Great Politics by Droshan, he talks about Nietzsche's vision of a kind of pan-European elite that would use a conflict with Russia to kind of unify a European identity and have a sort of legislating elite that would legislate values for all of humanity from this kind of pan-European project. And what it made me think about was the sort of structural similarities with Fanon's third worldism, right? So that Fanon's really worried about the post-colonial elites, their petty politics, right? The difference between petty politics and great politics, their investment in petty nationalisms, ethnic divisions, and he wants to somehow unify the third world above divisions of race and ethnicity and religion. And he thinks that you need a kind of traveling band of revolutionary intellectuals and gadflies to push this project along into an inevitable confrontation with Europe to legislate new values for all of humanity. He wouldn't put it in quite those terms, but I think those are the implications. And one of the fascinating things about the Black Power tradition, which I will end on, is that like Nietzsche's thing, I think it's in Schopenhauer's Educator, you evaluate a philosophy by trying to live by it. And what's really remarkable is that there were a generation of African-American activists who did try to live by it. Stokely Carmichael left the United States to try to play this role in Guinea. Malcolm X traveled the world trying to play this kind of role and unify the third world in a fight against what he saw to be a kind of white world order. Eldridge Cleaver fled to Algeria, Robert Williams in Cuba and China. And so you've got these figures, and what's remarkable is that not only did they actually attempt this project, and we can think a little bit about what the meaning of that project is now when people are looking again beyond American nationalism for the horizons of their politics, but also how quickly Europe congealed around resistance to these figures, how quickly British Secret Service, French Secret Service were able to decide that Malcolm X is a pernicious influence in our society, even if he's talking about the United States, that Stokely Carmichael should be allowed to travel nowhere in the former British Empire without being arrested and deported. So that there is something that's fascinating about this great politics conception that I hope we can linger on in further discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to you. I am not going to break the spell. Don't leave. I'm not going to just stop this from going ahead by sharing a series of comments. We have a very rich set of interventions, and I am sure you have a lot of questions, and I just urge you to share them with us. We will take some comments, some ideas, some questions, and then we will start commenting on them. So please. Yes. Oh. Bob.
So I have a question. I want to bring home about the discussion, the conversation with Brandon. So you thought this was Brandon Nietzsche and David Scott background. And I think the argument is to that Nietzsche is conventional fiction according to Nietzsche.
Robert, could you talk a little louder? Yeah, let's pass the mics around here a little bit.
Am I audible now? The picture you get in Wretched is a picture according to which the colonial subject is totally determined by colonialism. And so you require total revolution to undo that. And then the move that you want to make at the end is, well, maybe we can take revolution off the table, but rather than going the route of the Nation of Islam or whatever we can, opt for an expanded conception of violence and this kind of politics that we get if we expand, broaden our conception about politics, and then in that connection you invoke not only King but also Baldwin. So the question I want to ask has to do with this. What conception of the subject does that presuppose? If it doesn't presuppose a conception of the subject is totally determined, what conception of the subject does it presuppose? And it brings me back to Homi Bhabha's remarks for the following reason. It seems to me that the conception of the subject that's animating the argument of black skin white mass, I mean, it's very complicated, but at the very end, it's hard to avoid the Sartrean resonances, the resonances of the Sartre, of being a nothingness, the conception of a subject that is totally undetermined by history, be it the history of black people, be it, Sartre's Marxist dialectic, which he discusses in chapter 5, a totally undetermined subject that can, as it were, constantly reinvent him or herself. And that conception of subject is very much consistent, I think, with the idea that existentially and performatively in the text, there's this constant striving to assemble a self, but that assembly, but that effort to assemble or reassemble the self, I take it, is always, to borrow one of Edward Said's terms, always subject to kind of molestation. I strive to assemble. I'm thinking of the Said beginnings. I attempt to assemble myself, but I'm subject to disassembly when I'm subject to the look that says "look, a Negro," which again resonates with Sartre's analysis of the look and being a nothingness. So there's a conception of a totally undetermined subject, I think, that animates ultimately that argument. So I wonder if I see a kind of dichotomy between, on the one hand, an argument, a celebration of black skin white mass, which involves, a kind of Sartrean commitment to the possibility of radical freedom on the one hand, then the concept of the subject that's operative and wretched, conception of the subject as totally determined. I guess my question to to Brandon, do we need to go the route of a totally undetermined conception of the subject, a Sartrean radically free subject, in order to make the move that you want to make vis-a-vis King and Baldwin? And I guess the related question, Tommy Bob, is that Sartrean conception of the subject required to make sense of the constant effort to reassemble the subject in the face of its in the face of the vulnerability that it repeatedly finds itself subject to?
No, I want to hear the response. Would you pass me that mic, maybe? I think this one's not working.
Oh,
Yeah.
so that's, I like the flip of the coin. Now, I've been accused of hijacking Fanon. So, and and hijacking a number of other people for my purposes. So I hijack, that's my mode of critical engagement. I'm a hijacker. So it seems to me that can I just say one thing? My view of Fanon's psychoaffectivity is not that it is based on some general theory of repression. I feel, and I've always argued, that it's much more, there is, of course, an element of that, because how could there not be an interiorization, an affective play? Of course there is. But I think that Fanon really, to the extent to which you want to talk about the notion of repression, or it really works with disavowal.
Disavowal?
Disavowal. That's where it is. And I think that's why there is this kind of link between material, certain forms of material and historical reality creating a psychic effect, and the psychic effect rating. And you can see this, all the time. There's this kind of double passage, if you like, and I think that that's why, with some legitimacy, you can read it. In my introduction, I try and show the way in which the psychoaffective has actual implications for the politics of citizenship. And when he says that it's the glowing point between the individual psyche, if you like, or symbolic, and citizenship, I think that is exactly what he is attempting to do. Now, of course, with Fanon, like in a way with Benjamin or even Wittgenstein in a way, in a very different way, it can be construed. There is always the duck-rabbit problem. That's why I use this notion of the displacement of the angle of vision, in this charismatic way. So there is that in Fanon. On the one, and therefore, I think that to go back to your question, the issue in The Wretched of the Earth is not about being totally determined. And I tried to say that in my introduction, that this book has two time frames. One is the anti-colonial frame, but urgently insisting through it in the book is also, it's written, of course, in 1961, but as he says, that we will never know what our freedom is, not because freedom is a kind of eternal Sartrean chase, but because we are emerging in this world when we're asked to make a univocal choice. We're said either you join, either you're a socialist or you're a free market here, either you join America or Russia. How do we actually negotiate our freedom? So it's this kind of aporia, which I think makes it much more complicated than asserting either, and the aporia is also, as I want to say, resonant with the disavowal. I know, but so what? I know, but I don't want to know. I know, but I don't want to accept. So I think that's at least my reading of Fanon. It's not about repression and then revenge. It's not about oppression and then rampant violence. This is where I think Hannah Arendt got him completely wrong. in the book on violence. It's a much more nuanced thing. And to go back, Professor, to your question about the Sartrean Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks, I tried to make it clear how he is desperately negotiating. The whole book is so processual. Even the passages on, there's a brush with Sartre and then an opposition to Sartre. So these are strategic. I'm not saying he was strategizing, but they're sort of strategic obstacles, and then a way of working around them. That's why I see a kind of chiasma, continually working its way through, and a transvaluation in the Nietzschean sense. So it does seem to me that the question is not that the question of the problem of beginnings, that each time you assemble, then you are disassembled. I don't think that is the case. I think what it is that there is an assemblage. And think of the language, which actually came in Black Skin, White Masks, which came out to me much more strongly this time. It is my job to assemble. It is my job to concretize. But it is to do it in a way different from the structural modalities, the history of progress that I've been forced to occupy. So it seems to me that it's not just that there is this continual whirligig of time, but there's a very specific way of thinking of temporal measures, less than the long history and more than the fleeting moment. And that's why in the work I'm doing now, I'm focusing on the notion, figuratively put, of the diurnal, the daily, the day by day, continual insistence. So there is a determination there. There is a specific, but it may not be one for all time. There is a determination. It may not fit into long histories. It is concrete. It has its implications. It has its capacities. It has its agencies. But what he leaves open is working with historical opacity or ambiguity. And I think, therefore, it's not just revolution or nothing. And I think that he has been misrepresented. It's not repression or liberation. And I think the attraction, as I said at the end of my talk, this is my firm belief, is that people approach him because of the complexities he is actually willing to serve. And I think he's been badly served by Sartre, to tell you the truth. Because in fact, when they asked me to write the introduction, initially I said, no, I'm not going to do it. Why are you kind of, stringing me up? This is a canonical text by Sartre. Anything I write will look like shit compared to it. And, or we continually in the shadow. I hope it's not, but I mean, it may still be in the shadow. I'm not going to do it. I turned it down until they kept coming back to say, no, we wanted to do it. It's rereading Sartre, where I thought the general argument that Sartre was making, the striptease of our humanity, was a very narrow measure for what Fanon is trying to do here. Because the book is written in 1961, it looks in a way at the colonial struggle, anti-colonial struggle. It looks at early nationalism. It is not so different from what Du Bois called the collectivities, are not so different from what he called the quasi-colonial in 1940, if you remember, Du Bois's notion of the metropolitan quasi. He says, the problems of colonization are here in Paris, in New York, in Berlin, etc., etc. I won't. So it seems to me that the book is written looking back or looking at the colonial struggle. It is looking at the immediate incipient national movements, particularly the critique on bureaucracy and administrative reason, very strongly done. But then he raises the question, and I've written that there's a second time frame. What happens after 1989? He's almost proleptically looking at this. Because until this whole conflict between, either you're for us or you're against us, either you're in this camp or that, we will never know what our freedom is. That's why I think it's a moving, poignant, and very powerful way of thinking histories in that kind of, not simply in the kind of iterative structure of assemblage and disassemblage, but strategic relocation and positioning.
That's helpful.
Does that
Very helpful? Yeah. No.
That's my reading.
Clarify.
But then I've hijacked Fanon.
Okay.
I think I mean, for me, the sort of the key thing that I was thinking about was the difference between the psychoanalytic readings in Black Skin, White Masks and the cultural hermeneutics and Wretched of the Earth. That's, to me, what's there's a tension, right? So one of the things I think is extremely elegant about Black Skin, White Mask, in which I try to, when I lecture on it, I try to push over and over again because I think it's really easy to miss it, is that when he's giving these accounts of affective erethism, lactification, right? The idea that we just want to whiten our skin, things like that. He's very subtle, and he says, well, look, there are people who have neuroses. There are people who are going to have various psychological disorders, but in a racist society, they're going to find expression through avenues that have to do with this. So that, we live in a world where stereotype threat is a key explanatory concept because we live in a racist society. If we lived in some small town where there was no concept of race and you were just from a family that everyone thought was stupid, you're from the Johnson family, there would be a Johnson family stereotype threat. It would still probably have a kind of psychological expression, but it wouldn't take the form of race. And I think he's really elegant about doing that and say, there's some things race will exacerbate, there's some things it'll color. And so when we have these guys who become homicidal to whites, Eldridge Cleaver, I mean, I think is a great case of somebody probably a psychopath, and he finds expression in this way where he targets white women, right? But that's different than saying, which I think he's often taken as saying, is that, the society produces inevitably a bunch of incredibly pathological Negroes that love white women, and first chance they get, they'll snatch them out of their perch above the society. I think it's very different. Now, when you turn to Wretched, which I think is much more troubling, is that he just breezes through this complicated anthropology of Africa. I mean, it's not even just Algeria or the people he knows in the rural parts. He's like, man, all of these things share this common repressive impulse. And, I could confidently weigh in on that. And it explains why, and there's an intuitive plausibility to it. You watch crump dancing or like really aggressive Afro modern dance. You're like, man, these people are trying to work off something. Right? It seems plausible. When Stokely Carmichael gets up in Baltimore City and says, y'all will cut any Negro that steps on your shoes, he gets applause because people think they see. But my view is that he actually would be better served being more like the psychoanalyst we had in Black Skin, White Mask, who says, well, look, in a society where people are not sure that violence against them is going to be policed, dealt with in a kind of way that they think is fair, adjudicated in a regular processual manner, they're likely to take violence into their own hands. When you have to maintain a reputation amongst a small community that's segregated, because people will use you as a kind of predation, because it's a society, it's a part of the society that's suffering from material deprivation, you might have to resort to violence. Now, because we live in a racist society, these things get taken up in certain ways and they might have certain inflections. I might use the N-word when I rob you, but that doesn't mean that's coming from some place of deep abjection that explains all of it. Maybe it explains part of it. Maybe it explains the particular note of the expression. And so that's all I'm saying, is that I just want a critique of that kind of totalizing explanation that I don't think he has in his other work. I don't think it's in Dying Colonialism. I don't think it's in Black Skin, White Mask. I think it's in that part of Wretched of the Earth. And I think Black Power seizes on that because they get that before they get anything else, right? That's translated and then the other stuff comes, but that's already in everybody's mind. And you get the arguments worked up till they become basically gospel. I mean, we all, like, there's no one in this room who this is the first day they've heard the term black on black crime. You know what I'm saying? That's a widespread, extremely popular notion that people act as if it has explanatory import. And the only way I think it has explanatory import is to presume the normative expectation of Black solidarity and some kind of mechanism for why the Blackness is relevant to the phenomena, which to me, has to be based on a kind of psychology. And I think it's a pernicious notion that's done a lot of harm.
Emily and Thomas.
I guess I really at this point have just a question, which, just now, Brandon, you sort of recouped black skin, white masks, but I sense that you were sort of holding to account the whole framework of any kind of psychoanalytic interpretation that's either structural, which, there are obviously many reasons for it, falls into and reinforces all kinds of racist stereotypes and traps and everywhere you look, right? But I guess I'm unwilling to sort of go as far as you seem to want us to. I think, and maybe this is where I'm closer to Homie in trying to get at some of the intricacies of what he's contributing psychoanalytically. And I think you just did allude to the really big payoff, which is that sociogenic, what he calls sociogenic imprint of racism, and his discovery and it's a very interesting passage where he's actually reading a phrase of Nietzsche's and cuts off the first half of it, but where he talks about identifying with the chose vécue, the thing that's the lived experience, basically. So how do you bring the lived experience of racism, but also temporally this notion of immediacy, which he sort of gets, as Homie already alluded to, from Jaspers. And these are very complicated things, but I think if we bring them together, there's a reconceptualizing of how one practices a kind of clinical diagnostics, a psychiatrized politics. And I'm a little reluctant to give that up, because I think that's kind of where you were pushing for good reasons. But I also think there's another side of it.
Can I steal the mic while it goes to Homie for a second, because before it gets to you, so I think this is an incredibly productive conversation, and you're going to continue it. I did sense that you were trying to extricate some of the psychoanalytic in your reading, but then that does raise a question back to Brandon, but it's going to go to Homie next. But like so is there what else is there underneath those more kind of eventual relations that you were talking about, right? Like legitimation of the police, or delegitimation of the police, or the place of violence in a black market, in an underground market, right? In other words, so the question is, how do you bring in history without pathologizing it, but giving a little bit more depth, I suppose, than to those more I agree entirely with the importance of those, but they do seem thin somehow in understanding contemporary struggles a little bit. So we should come back to that. And
so I actually want to take up Emily's point and not to concede brand new. I will concede two things. One is that I've never gone along with the Fanonian hogwash about the new humanism. We have to go and get a new humanism where we can all touch each other and feel each other. All that stuff, I've always been critical of that moment. So this is partly to say you don't have to eat the whole pudding, You can pull the plums out of it, You can do what you want with it. And I think the pudding is complex here, There are many different layers of suet and pastry and all kinds of things here. So you've got to work with it. And that's what the challenge is. But there I will say that there is a moment where there is this kind of sellout to this humanism, and I think it becomes, frankly, it's that moment, I think, where the affective tension is released and you get a certain kind of sentimentality. I mean, I think that when Fanon tries to overcome the anxiety of alterity, the anxiety, then he loses it. But I do think he keeps that tension going for a long time. And the second thing that I do agree with you, but I see it also as a form of writing, are the broad kind of generalizations moving from African music to dance to this to that, to those areas. And I think that those are weak spots. But I think there is a lot to redeem itself in precisely and the uses of what he calls the psychoaffective, which is not simply a psychoanalytic, it's another mutation, another form, I think is actually very interesting. And he therefore works through the striations of the cultural issue and then cutting each one, not just layering, cutting across each one. So if you take just for a moment, I'm sorry for being so horribly kind of pedagogical here, but I'm on page 171. If you take this, I think, this is an example of how he moves across different kinds of registers and disciplinary platforms. This period is interesting because the oppressor is no longer content with the objective non-existence of the conquered nation and culture. This is a similar moment in Look to say, I gave them everything they wanted, but they kept on wanting more, which is the pathology of power. And that, I think, is a very interesting thing because it shows the weakness, in a sense, or where you can actually, in Gramscian terms, it shows where the anxiety, as Gramsci puts it, of the subaltern, in the moment of its action, in the moment of its agency, can actually use that anxiety in relation to the hegemon. So he says, is no longer content with the objective non-existence of the conquered nation and culture. So the oppressor will never be content, cannot be content, because ethically and politically, there is a kind of real weakness in that position, that imposition of power and authority. Every effort is made to make the colonized confess the inferiority of their culture. This goes back to the Foucault avowal seminar, to make them confess the, are we being, oh Christ. Has the revolution come? Okay, sorry. So everybody is made to make the colonized confess themselves, to avow. And this is where disavowal comes in, that their disavowal is based on an avowal. The inferiority of the culture now reduced to a set of instinctive responses, which he himself sometimes falls foul of, but is able to see, to acknowledge the unreality of their nation, their collectivity. There doesn't have to be a nation. In the last extreme, to admit the disorganized, half-finished nature of their own biological makeup. Interesting, half-finished. So it's always about this partial area. Now, this partiality, this thing that is never complete, the avowal and the disavowal working together. This, I believe, is the real complexity. Now, the fact that the complexity gets washed out in the various examples you show in the Black Power movement, I think that's a weak reading. That's not a strong reading or of Fanon. And therefore, I would like to put a break between the two things. I would like to say, okay, in a certain historical moment, why is it easy to pull certain things out of Fanon and not to see the complexity? But I wouldn't do it the other way and say, somehow, if you see what these people in the Black Power movement have done, you then can feed it back into a critique of Fanon in the way in which you suggested. So I have some problems with that.
So a couple of things. So one is, I'm not resisting any and all reference to psychoaffective argument, or that would be relevant to explaining critical social phenomena, including domination. There are any number of things that can only be explained like that. I think Homie's example, so there's a kind of white liberalism that demands, in excess of its fulfillment of various principles, a performance of gratitude, right? That's a kind of psychoaffective supplement to white liberalism that causes people to resist it, even when they might agree with all of the principles in the abstract.
Frank, can I say something here? It's not just gratitude. It is to say, I do not know what my desire is. It is undoing that desire. It's to say, I don't know what my desire is. I want more and I want more and I want more. It's like what Baldwin says about the discovery of the new Negro. He says, you know, every time in America, they want to discover the new Negro, the new Negro intellectual. It happens all the time. It is that those people in power don't know what they want. I think that's the great.
Right. So, and again, I mean, I want to resist, like, I don't want to be painted into the corner of, hey, I just reject this whole mode of thought, and other people like that. I'm not one of them. I think that your own examples underscore, which is why I had that sort of long prologue talking about Bob's work, which is that I think we all take up Fanon in the contemporary academy to critique white racism and colonialist fantasy and white supremacy, forms of colonial domination, Eurocentrism. And I think the subtlety on those registers far exceeds the kind of subtlety that he shows when he's referencing the kind of Pan-Africanist movements, Black movements, with the exception of negritude. I think he thinks a lot about negritude, but Black expressive culture. I just think he doesn't devote the same kind of energy, careful, thoughtful critique, precision to those questions. And it's precisely the kind of example that you use, right? So let's unpack the example of, not only do we want, we're not content with eliminating this nation. We want them to confess the inferiority of our culture. So what is that, right? What is that drive? What is that desire? Is it an affirmation of status, an affirmation of a kind of identitarian holism for the European, right, or for the oppressor? And if that's the case, then we might have, there might be drives, and this is a simple Nietzschean point, right? That there might be drives for status, for distinction, for power over others that are promiscuous. They can manifest themselves in any number of ways, and there's nothing essential to the experience of white rule that produces them. That just happens to be their expression in this historical moment. And so that's all I'm trying to just be careful about, is that I think when he's doing that, that's much more careful. When he's doing this other work about talking about, African expressive culture, Afro-American political struggles, Afro-modern politics, I think it looks different. And I don't think the precision is there. And I think he relies a lot more heavily on notions of repression that, even if you thought they might have been useful at that moment, I think our refusal to even talk about them when we teach this stuff evinces our own kind of skepticism and wariness about those moves. Like, those aren't moves we turn to. Those aren't moves they highlight. Whenever anyone in this room teaches Fanon, I would bet the money in my pocket that they don't talk about that.
I always talk about that.
Because I'm going to sit in. We work at the same school.
I think that Fanon is only useful to talk about white racism. I think about Fanon fundamentally to talk about Hindu fundamentalism in India today, and the way in which certain, the way in which a certain passionate politics, right, built around a theological, political thing, gets mobilized. So I think I think you stopped too soon. I think Fanon is translatable because of his interest in, just in one case, in ambiguity, but because of this kind of partiality, even in that passage. It's always about the partially.
Yeah. Well, I think we're just moving too quickly between. So I'm making a specific argument about the repression hypothesis and the particular form it takes. Now, I'm not making a totalizing argument about Fanon as such. There are lots of things that I think are really powerful about it. The turn to the lumpen, I think, has some useful and really interesting, exciting things. I think the turn to psychoaffective parts and the explanation of racist ideology is crucial. I think some of the stuff about the phenomenology of lived experience is really, really useful. I mean, it's not that I think, hey, we should just, it's not like an against Fanon as such, just like baseline.
Can I just say
Sure,
something?
sure.
I do think, though, that you're onto something about, testing out and getting, really into the fine grain of when these lived experience ideas start to sediment and become tools of, say, you know, psychologists who are diagnosing crime. I thought that was super convincing that you were arguing there. But where I'm still, but then I would contrast to that, say, the appendix or the last chapter where he's going through the case histories of all the Algerian prisoners. And there's an incredibly sophisticated analysis of how traumas work. And they're not necessarily, they skirt around certain stereotypes, and especially sexual. But I wouldn't say they just fall into a trap of universal repression, this or that, right? I mean, I think that every case is actually quite nuanced, very different.
And agency is continually, whether it's perverse, whether it's the French, the Algerian, agency. So I think, also how different constituencies can come together. You can take this notion, occult insensibility, the phrase that he uses, throw it away. But he then talks about how different constituencies come together. I found it very useful, actually, beginning to think about the Arab Spring, at one moment, or even Occupy Now. And so I'm not suggesting that you are, I think I disagree with you, and this notion of blanket notion of repression. As I tried to say, I think it's a more complex notion of disavowal. There are different kinds of strategies. I disagree with you on that. But that there are forms of generalization about certain issues. Humanism, I think, is one of them. It's clear that that is true. But I do think that the translation of it, the caricature, or the simplification, cannot simply be a critique of him. I think it's a critique of, or an explanation of a moment in which certain things get taken up, the way in which, as you say, you keep on talking, the way in which the academy might make people read in one way or read certain things and not others, the version of psychoanalysis as a kind of psychology, which is the third deformation. I mean, I think these are the, I would just say it needs much more sifting out, because I think there is a lot there that is contradictory, but I think out of the contradictions, there is great productivity.
Thank you. Steffi, you wanted to say something?
Yes, if I can. First of all, I want to thank all three of you, actually four, because Bob intervened as well, because I've been the last couple of months at least in a terrible funk. Psychologically, last not musically, and this conversation really feels good. So I want to talk about Black Power, but inevitably, given this conversation to get there, I think that I would like to open a certain window in the discussion about psychoanalysis. One of the things that I think is very important in Homi's presentation is the way, Homi, that you use the trope translation, and not just in your comments now, in the presentation, and alluding to a certain kind of transformative capacity at the moment of interpellation, so that interpellation doesn't actually find its end. It's not resistance to interpellation or defiance. It's a kind of almost sort of misplacement of it. And what this suggests to me is the psychoanalytic element that's essential to Fanonian thinking all the way through. Of course, we can't, that's an obvious thing to say. Regardless whether it might involve certain kinds of categories or even technical notions. Obviously, the repression hypothesis is a technical notion. In essence, it is really about subjectivity and about I would actually say sort of a poetic subjectivity, a subjectivity that is, of course, we know that it's riveted from psychoanalytic thinking. We know that. We know that it is difficult to be bounded. We know that it is contradictory, internally contradictory. We know all that stuff. But what appears in Fanon's thinking is that subjectivity is the site of transformation, the way that, in fact, a new form can emerge in and from within the kind of warlike encounter. I mean, enmity, a warlike encounter. And a translation in that sense means literally kind of moving from this place to another place. And this moving from this place to another place is not just simply positional. It is really something else. Now, this is really crucial to the way what you broadly call Black power, I think is also, I don't know to what extent it would be entirely clear to them, but their practice from late Malcolm all the way to the sort of Panther movement and then Stokely and so on, suggests a kind of poetics. And this has been discussed a lot, really. I'm not actually saying something that's that new, a certain kind of performativity of a kind of subjectivity that is anxious, perhaps even desperate, but certainly agonistically engaged with getting out of the bipolar, as it were, game. So that's a certain kind of philosophical framework that I'm not being a referee here, because I do think the disagreement is quite fair, but that I would suggest you would include in the psychoanalytic reading, Brendan. Now, there is also a historical component, which we all know. It was not discussed, but it must be discussed. And this is really a kind of, a kind of Bandung or sort of post-Bandung sensibility, which is utterly evident in the discussion about the national and the international that Homi said, national consciousness, non-nationalism, etc. And which is absolutely the case in the way that Black power thinking, that's also obvious, again, going down the line, Malcolm and so on. Now, this is where I think I have to disagree with you, Homi, on this issue of humanism. You can say that the reception of the new humanism is, fluff, fine. But if we're going to engage seriously with what he's trying to express, Fanon that is the same kind of Bandung-like not reimagination, new imagination, transformation of a certain kind of humanism that's clearly not European, civilizational, but it is a kind of anti-colonial humanism, which does not need the anti-humanism of Lacan, let's say. It does not need that phase. It is a kind of, it's similar, in that sense, it's similar to what you're describing in terms of the translation at the moment of interpolation. And that's how I like to read it. This is how it resonated with, in fact, the Panthers and the internationalism that they were engaged in entirely. So, including even the affirmative practices of the Panthers, the health programs, the educational programs. We're talking about creations, poetic creations of new forms of course, subjectivity, which is collective, and so on and so forth. And the last thing I would say has to do with the issue of violence. There is violence in this act. There is poetic violence. So violence, we don't need to get caught up in this business about, the obvious stuff, which is, armed resistance and so on. There is violence, there's destructive / creative violence that takes place in that sort of, instance of this, sort of poetic enactment.
I love the fact that you stress, that the poetic actually speaks very closely to a certain kind of politics of interpolation. And you're right, I started by showing the complexity of what we call interpolation and why, look and Negro. What are you to look at? What do you get out of that looking? All these are complex issues. Now, we have to also concede that from what you say, I'm happy to go along with you, Stathis, and say that there is a kind of powerful and important aspirational aspect to this. That's why I called it a proleptic moment. But there is the truth too, that unfortunately, for various reasons, and I'm somebody who admires failure, that for various reasons, the Bandung spirit, which was so productive, actually fizzled out. It didn't. I'm not saying therefore that it did fizzle out. So when you just talk historically, I mean, that moment was so productive because it had African American writers, it had Indians, it had Chinese. People did come together. It's not that different than the aspirations in Du Bois's Dark Princess, at least towards the end of the book. But I'm just saying that it seems to me that philosophically, this humanism is more a clarion call to be admired and loved, but less convincing in itself. Whereas a number of other areas in Fanon, even when they look elusive and problematic, as I think said in response to what, you can actually see how they work strategically. I don't see that call for humanism other than its lyric, poetic invocation. And indeed, it represents itself quite often in those literary forms. There is not an essay really on the new humanism. It is the beginning, it's the end, it's a kind of invocation. And that's all I'm saying, that it is a problematic thing. For that, I think more useful and actually very Fanonian is the relatively late essay, Peace and Proximity by Levinas, where he says the same, he makes the same critiques, where he talks about Europe against Europe. And, that not as a negation for a sublation, but talks about, and then talks about the intrahuman in that context, the way institutions and humanity have to reconceptualize the object of humanism. I'm just saying to you that maybe I'm actually very interested in that work, and it does many of the same things, and it seems to me to have more traction to it. It is not the instinct, it is not the value that I just, it's just the question of traction in terms of justice, in terms of institutions of power. These things in an equally poetic way, in Peace and Proximity, I think, are delivered. So maybe, I just want to say that. But otherwise, I'm very much in agreement.
The only thing I'd add, I think, is that, Césaire plays a big role in this particular conversation with the poetics, and is so full in, black skins. And then, of course, the problems that Fanon had with, departementalisation and all of that really changes, and you see the difference, right? Although,
Of negritude,
right,
comes
right. Yeah.
This is, to be really brief, this is partly what I'm trying to get at with just posing the question about the relationship to all of these kind of clarion call philosophical moments, these genuflections to humanism and the politics, right? So not to dissociate poetics and politics at all, right? I've written on the
I know.
I've written exactly on this Panther question
right.
precisely. I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I think what I was referencing in this about these are just like regular citizens acting like diplomats, right? To seize the mantle of diplomacy from states and act on behalf of revolutionary movements, student groups, oppressed populations is a kind of violence. It transgresses the prerogatives of the state. But the question about the relationship to politics is, I think, important because for Fanon, I think a lot of the new humanism has to be worked out through the praxis of revolutionary struggle, right? And his experience of moving around the world across racial lines, religious lines, and being accepted as a fellow in struggle, right? I think did give him a kind of aspiration that this shared project might generate a new humanism, right? It's that kind of praxis, that's the Marxist moment. What I think is jarring for me is that if his relationship to these various cultural formations is one that treats them as expressions of repression, then those materials are now off limits for the reconstruction of a humanism, unless they get kind of moved through like the veil to serve a kind of actual revolutionary purpose, right? So they become instrumentalized like the veil and dying colonialism. I mean, and we know, right? We know his resistance to the blues. We know his resistance to trying to work out any kind of salvageable notion for negritude, right? And so my question is not to defend negritude. My question is not to be a cultural nationalist by any means, but it is to say, well, you know, where's the new humanism coming from? For those of us who still have a Du Boisian,
In essence,
vision,
from
is that-
nothing.
right? That's the, I mean, that's the Sartrean piece.
I mean,
of
it doesn't have to be existentialist, however. I mean, it comes from the shards that colonialism has left behind, but not looking to try to find an essence in those shards. I mean, this is really the way I understand the thinking in Wretched of the Earth. Right at the point where, on the one hand, he elevates national consciousness and critiques nationalism simultaneously. I mean, you said it perfectly. I mean, it's basically international.
The essence to think that here's a
He
cultural
is in a
resources
revolution.
work.
Sorry, I'll say this one thing. In a revolutionary moment that he's in, where he's fighting for people other than his own, this is really important, right? Because he actually thinks that this struggle is for all people who have been under colonial rule. Okay, at that point, essence, you know, the essence of the past, it's a kind of, it's a terrible ruse. That's what he's saying. And he's saying, face the fragments, the fact we are broken. This is not repression. We're completely broken. It's not that we're broken and we have kept it under. It's we are surrounded and we inhabit everything broken. From that, we create.
But that's his humanism.
Yeah.
That is precisely his humanism. That's precisely the moment
Yeah,
where
that's
he
right.
actually appears to be in the mode of a neo-humanism. This is precisely the moment of a struggle which is not his own. It is a struggle which comes from he's a Martinique. I mean, he's from Martinique. He's not from Africa, right? He is not an Indian, right? That's precisely the politics that he's actually animating. And this is, it comes on the heels of Bandung. It comes on the heels of the Bandung humanism, but it is a new understanding of what it means to be human. And that's the response that he gives, Hamid, to the question that you have already asked, right? We don't know what our freedom is. We do know in Fanon what our freedom is, because he says that what this freedom is what makes us all human, right? And that's the point where he goes and he actually eschews all essentialisms. That is precisely where he goes beyond, above anything that might be construed as anything other than what we are, which is the basic, most common denominator, right?
I see. I mean, look. Let's track this thing, because Fanon is a very processual thinker. You know, he doesn't land here and then go somewhere. So I think I'm not disagreeing with you. In fact, what I call the chiasmatic translation, you could now say, if you added up these things, you would get a picture of what he thinks the human is. I'm just saying that you're absolutely right. It's more in the practice, because it's not only that he is not Martinican, but he's criticized by those in Martinique saying, you know, what are you doing? You know, why don't you come and fight the good fight at home? It's not that he's, you know, adored by the Algerians and Tunisians. As I say in my introduction, there's a lot of suspicion around what he's doing, and eventually he sidestepped and opposed. So in the practice, I see it. I'm just saying conceptually, whereas I see a lot of developments and I don't see that. But if you want, sorry, you get my point. I agree with you. But if you want to talk about repression in Fanon, not disavowal, which I think is much more, talk about what happens to women right through those texts. There you really see something. I mean, I think you have this blanket category, my dear Brent, which I don't completely go with on repression. I wouldn't put it that way. It's a more complicated mechanism. But as far as women go, you know, About women, I don't know. What does he say? He's got a phrase, you know. Freud says, what do women want? He says, I don't even know what women want, you know. What is it that they want? I don't know. That, I think, is a real issue. And if we do something at Harvard on Fanon, I want to do it from that, being an avoué, you know, being somebody who, I want to do it from that perspective, because I think that opens up a lot of things to do with sexuality. Look at his homophobia too. You know, he was very homophobic. I think David Macy also develops, you know. So I think there's a whole area around sexuality for somebody who is sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I hate to do this.
No, but do
I
it.
hate to
Do
do
it.
this. And we have so many things
Do
to
it.
discuss.
So yeah, and of course, Joseph Lawless is
Joseph
working
wants to say-
precisely on these questions of sexuality and in relationship to Fanon. So we'll continue that conversation as well. And give the last
I'm so
word
sorry
to
for
Emily.
talking.
Yes. No, not at all.
So,
Last word to you, Emily.
Okay, I just would interject very briefly that in response to Stathis's very moving evocation of the importance of Fanon in terms of humanisms to come that are post Bandung, or that connects a bit, I think, with what you were discussing with the kind of great politics, yeah. I think though that in my own reading, what I tried to, and what strikes me is the Fanon that nobody has really engaged with particularly is one that isn't necessarily true to his political struggles, but it's more that the psychoaffective helps us generate another kind of vocabulary politics, which institutional politics or structural politics, and this is a bit my dada, my polemic, because I've been doing this book on unexceptional politics, but I think there is through the affective, and that's not weighing in on whether they have been used properly or not, whether or not they've lent themselves, terms like microaggression or even nano racism could easily be conscripted to all kinds of psychologizing ends in the criminal justice system and beyond. So I'm not arguing with you on that, but I do think that what's fascinating when you talked about and underscored the political, I think it extends into a micro political vocabulary that can't be dislinked from the psychiatric. And it's in the way he analyzes things. It's not necessarily through a labeled vocabulary, but it's in some of the things that he describes that normally escape the political, but are very much of now. There's a contemporaneity in that for me, and it's to do with a vocabulary that is not normally sort of built into political theory or classical political philosophy.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so we invite you all to join us tomorrow at 2 p.m. for a conversation about Keely McBride's book, Mr. Mother Country. We really thank our speakers today. Special thanks to Anna Krautheimer, without whom we wouldn't be here. So thank you all. Thank you.
Armadas